Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Danny Nierenberg. Every Monday, we've been trying to interview food and agriculture business leaders who are working hopefully to change the business of food and agriculture for the better and find what better ways to nourish both people and the planet. A reminder that this episode will also appear on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. So please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Today, I'm excited to talk to Martin Wolf, the director, and I really love this title of Sustainability and Authenticity at Seventh Generation. Seventh Generation manufactures and distributes ecological, household, and personal care products. Martin has more than 40 years of experience in industrial and environmental chemistry and has been recognized as one of 9 heroes with impact by Unilever for his work on preserving the environment. Martin works to create frameworks for sustainable product design and distribution at Seventh Generation, and the company aims to use 100% bio-based or post-consumer recycled materials and ingredients by 2025, among some of its other environmental goals. I was telling Martin earlier that my house is pretty much filled with Seventh Generation products and has been since I was in my 20s. So thank you so much for creating these products that I can feel good about. And Martin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And thank you for using our products.
Sure. So, Martin, you come from this very, very technical and scientific background. And I'm wondering about sort of that journey from, that very rigorous science to the corporate world, what that was like.
Well, it's actually been a life's journey. It started when I graduated from college with my baccalaureate in chemistry and started working for an agricultural chemical company. And I fortunately was involved in studying the fate and metabolism of chemicals in the environment. And frankly, at the time, I thought the company was doing a fairly good job of understanding what happened to its chemicals. And then I left, started working for a company that actually made instrumentation to look for chemicals of concern in the environment. And we started finding them in food, in agricultural products, in automobiles and cosmetics. And I realized we weren't doing as good a job as we thought we were.
Sure.
I started my own laboratory that grew, got sold. So I did what many unemployed CEOs do and became a consultant. And Seventh Generation was one of my clients. And it's still a journey of learning. So that's sort of how I transitioned from pure technical to a combination of technical and business.
It's great that it was such a journey of learning. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of when you sort of realized that these chemicals were more persistent than you had previously thought. If you got pushback from either the company you were working for at the time or as a consultant, if companies gave you if they gave you a hard time.
No, I'm pleased to say that most companies took the findings and worked to understand them and see what they could do about them. Occasionally, especially when I had my own laboratory, and particularly in small and middle-sized companies that didn't have a lot of resources, you would get some pushback and even get asked to tweak a number or two. But fortunately, they didn't push hard, and it never had to happen or become a real contest. But no, I think most companies really do want to do better than they do.
That's great. And that is good to hear. It's just such a stark contrast. I talked to Carrie Gillum, who wrote a book about Monsanto, the Monsanto files last week. And it's just such a different sort of environment. And you're right. I think, and she and I talked about it. Most companies are not made up of, evil folks. They're made up of individuals, some with, good intentions and some with, obviously bad intentions. But when it's on such a widespread level, like it was at Monsanto, you start to think, all these companies are bad, which is not the case. I mean, Seventh Generation has obviously, been one of the good players in all of this for a very long time. But it is a journey to get there. It is, these companies come about because they have good people who are working for them. There's an ethos that's sort of built in.
I think that particularly at Seventh Generation, there is a desire to do the right thing, but also a recognition that we don't always have the ability or the knowledge to do what's, quote, right.
Sure.
And I think in many companies, especially larger companies, the individuals may want to do the right thing, but they work in a framework
Right.
that biases how they think about things and biases how the company reacts. And that's why I think there's a need for system change, not just individual corporate change.
Sure. And that kind of leads me to my next question. I mentioned that you, in 2019, I almost said last year, in 2019, you were recognized as one of 9 heroes with impact by Unilever for your work on the environment. And I'm wondering, so, if we need this system change, what advice do you have for other businesses, both, startups or, and the big players in this kind of universe of, of what they can do to push for system change, even though it might affect their bottom line?
I think that last phrase is the key. Companies have to recognize that the triple bottom line sounds like a good idea, but as long as we can very precisely measure profit and can only generally measure people and planet, profit will always win out, because companies operate their businesses based on their cash flows, how much they sell, how much things cost, and how much they have left over in profit. We have to change that paradigm. We have to look more at how to do good in the world, more at how to create systems of commerce that rely on nature rather than just extract from nature.
I mean, this is the movement in lots of the that we're seeing. I mentioned before, some companies sort of have to change their practice. Other companies start out, very mission driven. And I think, seventh generation is often sort of looked at as, a company that started mission driven, but also realized that, as you mentioned, the framework with it, that it is in is a hard, you still have to sort of play by the standard rules. But I think, the company is probably now at a point where you're thinking about breaking those rules.
Well, I think we've been breaking the rules all along. It was easier when we were a small independent company, but Unilever has been a great parent company. When we were acquired, Paul Polman was the CEO of Unilever, and he came to Vermont and told us they bought us for a reason, that there will be pressure to change, but we shouldn't, because they want to learn from us. And they have been. One of the really exciting things to report is that when they acquired us, we had about 86% post-consumer recycled plastic in our packaging, and they had about 1.5%.
Wow.
And today, just 4 years later, they have over 25%, moving toward 50% PCR in their plastic packaging. Some brands are at 100%. So that's, to me, an incredible indication of how much Unilever wants to change. And they announced last year a program called Clean Futures, where they've adopted seventh generation's approach of all ingredients coming from bio-based materials and being biodegradable, so that you're not contaminating the environment with the materials that you make. And I like to misquote the scientist philosopher Archimedes, who said, "Give me a Unilever large enough and I will move the world." Well, seventh generation has a really big Unilever, and we're making change in this world.
Well, I mean, I think it's an important lesson. And I've heard this from other companies like Nyman Ranch that was acquired by Purdue, or Applegate that was, acquired by Hormel, that, they can still keep their values, the things that made those companies, and those are protein companies, right? But I think the sort of comparison is still holds true that, as long as you have a parent company that's willing to learn and not sort of destroy your values, because that's happened in the past for many companies too, that, it creates a whole different, it creates that paradigm shift, or at least the steps for that paradigm shift to happen that you mentioned before.
Yeah, I think small companies like seventh generation and the others you mentioned have a purpose, a mission to change the world and create greater sustainability. And we also know we can't do it by ourselves. We're just too small. even as a very successful company, Seventh Generation is still, less than 1% of the cleaning products market in North America. So we need to convince larger companies like Unilever or like Hormel
Sure.
or Purdue to do things better.
Well, one of the things that you've been trying to convince Seventh Generation to do better is lobbying for phosphate bans in a number of states, and I'm wondering how that kind of came about.
So, like much of this journey, I'd say it came about accidentally, or at least not with the appreciation of what it would take. So, in the period I was consulting to Seventh Generation, we're talking about the 1990s, the state of Massachusetts was considering a phosphate ban. Seventh Generation was already making its detergents without phosphates. And I was asked if I would testify. And I had never testified before, but I said, okay, I will. So I went in, heard conventional industries say phosphate detergents can't work. And I said, yeah, they can. We make one. We test it against competitive large brands, et cetera. So people should try them. A few years later, I got invited to another state. I think it might have been Minnesota, and actually brought samples with me to hand out. The law didn't pass in Massachusetts. It didn't pass in Minnesota. It didn't pass in Wisconsin. It didn't pass in a half dozen other states. And then finally, Washington State in 2006 passed a phosphate ban. And it was sort of funny because by that time, the people from the Soap and Detergent Association and I had given our spiels so many times, we joked we could switch roles and they would never know because they had no idea what it looked like. In any event, once that happened, state after state passed the phosphate bans, and the entire industry decided to voluntarily stop using phosphates rather than have to make special detergents for certain markets. And it just amazed me, the power that persistence and demonstrating the fact that things can be done can have.
Absolutely.
And that's sort of how I began my lobbying career.
Sure. Well, and that the science is there and that you can prove it. And I think that, it's not just that those companies didn't want to change. They didn't want to, they didn't want to change for every state, but they knew consumers would eventually, and they did. Consumers were catching on. Lots of parents were like, I don't want, to wash my kids' clothes in this or have this, in my house. So that kind of awareness around science, I think, is something that, having, a scientist like you leading Seventh Generation, that's really helpful because you can talk about these things on a number of levels.
Agreed. And it takes a village, as has often been said. It takes the science, it takes people who communicate better and more effectively than I do, who hear what I say and translate it into meaningful ways. And it takes everyone at Seventh Generation who designs products, packages products, markets products, distributes products to make it work. If we fail in any of those places, then the really, I think, wonderful products we make just wouldn't be in the marketplace. Absolutely. And we wouldn't have the impact that we have.
Right. I'm wondering if you can talk about your, it's 2021, which is still boggling my mind. I feel like I'm still in 2019, but you have sustainability goals set for 2025. And I'm wondering if you can talk about those.
Sure. So Seventh Generation has been setting long-term goals since roughly 2012, 2013. And at that time, we set 2020 goals. For example, we wanted zero waste. And the way we envisioned this was to have all of our incoming materials either from a bio-based source, so nature renewed it, or from a recycled source, so it was technically renewed. And we wanted everything we made to either biodegrade if it came from nature or be recyclable if it came from a mechanical source. So as we approached 2020, we saw that we were not going to make those goals. We came close. About 97% of our packaging is recyclable and 100% biodegrades if it's from nature. And unfortunately, only 86% of our packaging input is from PCR. So as we approached 2020, we started thinking about, well, how do we improve our goal? and how do we improve what we're doing to reach those goals. So we realized that making a recyclable package from recycled materials is great, but unless you also have the infrastructure
Right.
to collect the materials, process them, and make them suitable to reuse, we'll never reach our goal of zero waste. And that's where advocacy clearly comes in, because we're not a recycling company. We are not a municipality that collects waste. So we needed to look for ways to advocate for the changes that are needed to reach zero waste. Another example is our greenhouse gas goals. Mm-hmm. So our initial goal was very aspirational. We said zero carbon emissions from fossil fuels, which would be great. But again, as we approach 2020, well, even before, we realized that what we needed to do was look at science-based targets and set goals based on those. And when we started looking at our carbon footprint, we realized 90% of our impact is in what's called scope 3, which is the emissions when consumers heat water to do their laundry or to wash their dishes. And again, nothing we could do could really change that. What had to change was the way energy was supplied to consumers. And again, we had to advocate for changing the electrical grid, advocate for gasoline-free vehicles, etc. And in 2019, yes, I'm also losing track of time. We worked with the Sierra Club to get 100 cities to agree to 100% renewable energy by 2030, and actually 130 cities signed on. So it was really a successful advocacy.
That's great. I mean, I'm sure when you started out in your career, you didn't realize that the lobbying part, obviously, that we talked about before, or this advocacy part would be such a big part of your job, every day. And I want to go back to the advice for, small and big companies alike. This has to be part of their job description, this advocacy role, if we're really going to change things, if we're really going to address the urgency of the climate crisis.
That's absolutely true. And some of the places I see this being done and done poorly is by some of the large companies. So for example, large beverage companies all talk about the need to recycle their packaging as they see more and more of it on Greenpeace posters asking, is this your packaging? And that sounds great. And they do have programs to recover and reuse some of their plastic materials. But when I go to legislatures to talk about bottle bills, here in Vermont, as an example, the American Beverage Association, the ABA, is there arguing against them. You can't, as a company, promote one idea, but then have your trade association work against it. And the same thing happens in the cleaning industry. Companies want to do the right thing in many ways because their consumers want it, but then our trade association may come out with positions that are not well aligned. So we need to find ways to change that and get companies aligned with their industry associations, aligned with creating more sustainable ways of doing commerce.
Absolutely. And it's very different for companies to say they want to do the right thing, but then to actually do it. And I think the pandemic, maybe one silver lining, and there are several, there's also a lot of incredibly bad stuff that has happened over the last year and a half. But one silver lining, I think, more and more people tell me about that John Oliver episode on plastics, and people got really informed during the pandemic by watching documentaries or watching more and more John Oliver or whoever. And I think it's hard, it's more difficult now to trick or hoodwink consumers than it was maybe a year and a half ago, because a lot of folks have had more time on their hands and the ability to sort of consume information differently or pay attention more, and understand that the pandemic is not the last global shock that's going to hit us. And so I think that it's not as easy to trick consumers anymore.
I would agree, but it's also easy, how can I say this, to put forth solutions that are not solutions, to take
Sure.
actions that don't lead to solutions. And these are really large problems. They're
Yeah.
problems that require not just a company to change or consumer habit to change, but entire systems to
Right.
change.
Great
And
point.
that takes time, it takes energy, it takes money, and it takes all segments of our society working together to make the change, for the change to happen.
Absolutely. Martin, you sound very sort of optimistic and hopeful as I listen to you, but these long-term changes, a lot of us who've been concerned about these issues for a while don't understand why they always haven't been part of either government or company or company corporate structures, or what governments have been up to. How do you sort of not become jaded as you do this work day to day?
Oh, I become jaded. But I think it's the optimism I see in the generation that is following. And as long as they're optimistic, I have no reason to be pessimistic.
Right.
And, I have the great fortune of working with so many really smart, capable, young individuals. And I love it. It gives me energy,
Sure.
and it gives me optimism that change is going to come.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's young people who keep me and Food Tank going, because they know things are going to change. And I hope I felt that way when I was their age, but they know things are going to change for the better. And that's what keeps me going. Sort of back to some of the goals that seventh generation has. One of them is to really protect waterways by ensuring no water is contaminated during a product's life cycle. And that sounds like such a big, goal to me. And I want to work to achieve that.
So first, I should point out that that's a 2030 goal, whereas the others
Okay.
I discussed were 2025 goals.
Thank
And
you for
that's
the
because we
clarification.
haven't figured out how to do it yet.
Sure.
So we gave it a further deadline. But like any large problem, you begin to solve it by understanding the system that created it and where you can make changes in the system. So, uh, we looked initially at our own products, making sure that they biodegraded so they would not accumulate in the environment and contaminate it. Then we looked at our suppliers upstream and how they made the ingredients for our products. We have to look downstream next. When people wash their clothes, we know now that microfibers are released into the environment. Well, how do we stop that? We as seventh generation probably can't, but working with clothing manufacturers and
Sure.
washing machine manufacturers, hopefully we'll be able to. So again, it gets back to this need for system change and all components in the system working together to affect the change.
Right. And it's kind of like not unlikely collaborations, but partnerships with sort of, folks you wouldn't expect, whether it's those washing machine manufacturers or the clothing suppliers. Those kinds of relationships are key to really building that systemic change.
Absolutely. And that's why having organizations like Food Tank that bring people together to talk about issues and how to approach them is so powerful. And I
Thank
think we
you.
need more discussions.
Absolutely. We need to be talking about these issues very frankly and in a blunt way, so that we can really achieve some, not necessarily the solution, but a set of steps to get to the solutions that we need, and to feel safe in that space. Again, it goes back to that idea of sort of cooperation, where you're not all in this competitive space, but really working together to cooperate and figure things out. I love seventh generation's mission, which is why I've been, a buyer of your products. And I just want to read it so folks can hear it. It's to transform the world into a healthy, sustainable, and equitable place for the next 7 generations. And so I guess, for folks listening, they might be asking, well, why 7 generations?
So our name comes from the great law of the Iroquois, now called the Haudenosaunee Nation. And this is a confederation of several Native American tribes, and they have a great law, which is essentially their constitution. And one of the laws is, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decision on the next 7 generations. So that is the source of our name, and I have to give appreciation to the Native American tribes that came together to come up with that way of living and of teaching.
Absolutely. There's no question that we have a lot to learn from the Native communities upon which, so many of us stand on stolen land, and need to recognize that more and more. I'm wondering what that sort of mission to protect or, create a more equitable world for the next 7 generations. What does that look like at staff meetings or at other meetings, or when you meet with partners?
So notice it says nothing about profit. And that gives us the freedom to talk about what needs to be done to make a product that is safe, that works well, that comes from farms that are regenerative rather than extractive from the soil, farmed by farmers who are appropriately rewarded for their work, or safe from sexual abuse or labor abuse, etc. So having that mission and having it solely about people's health, people's well-being, and the well-being of the planet gives us the what word should I use? I'll say privilege of saying no when something seems very desirable from a profit standpoint, and yet has an adverse impact, an impact we would not want one of our products to have.
Wow, that's pretty powerful, and a lot of companies don't have that sort of privilege or ability to do so. So that's commendable. We've talked a lot about what advice you would give other companies, both large and small. And for the final question, I'm wondering what advice you give consumers. I mean, there's a whole landscape I feel like consumers are sort of faced with every time they go, to their co-op or to Target or wherever they shop for, 7th generation products, or organic and regenerative and sustainable products. There's a lot to navigate when you want to do well with the money you have to spend on, to keep your household running. And I'm wondering, what would you tell, my mom or, the parents out there who want to keep their kids safe from harsh chemicals?
So the first thing I say is there's no one solution. I like to point out that there are 452,000 species of beetles on this planet, because no one beetle is going to do everything that needs to be done. So people need to do what suits them. They know how much money they have, they know how much time they have, they know how their family operates, and they need to keep that above all else. Being kind and loving, not only to their family, but to others, is another piece of advice that I think we all need to follow. And then know before you go to the store what you want to achieve and what you need to buy to achieve that. So if safety of a product is of concern to you, if you don't want to have chemicals that are concerning, do your research. See what ingredients are used in a product. More and more companies now are putting that online, or you can call up their ingredient lists using a QR code on the package, and develop a brand, develop trust in different brands. So that when you go to a store, you don't have to look at every label. You can generally trust that brand. And if you need to, you can investigate a certain product for the next time. So that's how I would approach it.
That's really good advice, and I think a really practical way to approach these issues, and developing that trust and feeling good, so that every time you need to pick something up, you can go to that brand and feel good about it. And I have to say that I've been doing this podcast slash livecast for a couple of years now, and there are probably 500 plus episodes, between the live stream and the podcast itself, and no one has ever given the advice to be kind and loving to one another. And I think you would also say the earth. So thank you for bringing that up. We need more advice about being kind and loving to ourselves, to our fellow humans, and to the planet. I think that's really wonderful. If folks want to find out more information about Seventh Generation, Martin, where can they go?
We have a website, www.seventhgeneration.com, and we have a helpline. I don't know the number offhand. Actually, I do. It's 800-456-1191. I don't know how I remembered that. And then I will make this offer that if anyone wants to reach out to me directly, it's martin.wolf@seventhgeneration.com. Again, martin.wolf@seventhgeneration.com.
That's great. And we'll have that available on our social media as well. Martin, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I want to remind folks that this will again be available on our podcast, Talk with Danny Nierenberg. And I hope folks will join me back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time, when I'll be talking to Erling Cruz from Kitchen Connection. Thank you so much, Martin. And I hope to meet you in person someday. It's been a pleasure.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.